I think that this current banking fiasco is a perfect example of why England needs to be independent, with a parliament that can operate to safeguard English interests. This crisis may be worldwide, and it may have been precipitated by American profligacy, but each individual country and each bank is responsible for its own well-being. The banks involved have been the authors of their own destruction. Greed motivated them, and greed will bail them out, I'm afraid. In a country such as Britain, where the government legislates to control almost every aspect of every citizen's life, why is it that they cannot exercise just a little control over big money organisations to ensure the prudence that Mr. Brown so famously brags about? Let us look at the banks involved. The three that are so far known to be in need of our cash are the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Bank of Scotland and Lloyds. Barclays have just announced that they do not need our money and can raise sufficient funds themselves. One suspects that Barclays were initially included for political purposes. It was far too revealing to have the two biggest banks in Scotland in desperate trouble without some English input to dilute their national disgrace. Two of the three are held up as Scottish icons. These were the organisations that epitomised Scottish success, independence, prestige, and they print their own unnecessary Scottish money. This picture shows the relative losses by percentage. The biggest bank is the Royal Bank of Scotland, then Lloyds, and then finally the Bank of Scotland. Share prices are an indicator of confidence and well-being. The Bank of Scotland has dropped 89%, 9/10. The Royal Bank of Scotland 80%, 8/10, and the English bank has dropped by 60%, 6/10. The publicly funded bailout is this: £15 billion to the Royal Bank of Scotland, £10 billion to the Bank of Scotland. Note that this is twice its current market value, and £7 billion to Lloyds. That is £25 billion to save Scottish banks, £7 billion for the English-based enterprise, making up the £32 billion so far requested. It is obvious where the money was desperately needed and why Brown was so eager to commit our money. As a result of this heavily biased handout, the Scottish banks have experienced an increase in share price, yet these are supposedly the weakest ones. The English-based and stronger bank has gone down. Ridiculous. It shows that the markets appreciate only too well that the Scottish banks are prioritised in order to guarantee survival. The cost to each individual of Brown's generosity is £32 billion divided by the whole British population, and that comes to £533 for each and every person. Now 5 million Scots contributed £2.6 billion, and 50 million English contributed £26 billion. The remaining £4 billion by the other two countries, whose finances are heavily subsidised by the English anyway. So Scotland put in 8% of the rescue money and received over 70% of the cash, giving them a profit of over £23 billion. This is part of what the Tartan Mafia in Westminster describe as the British Dividend for Scotland. They are once again honouring their public oaths, the Scottish claim of right to put their own people first and committing future generations of English people to crippling debt in doing so. They hold the English in such contempt that they confidently dismiss any possibility of English resistance. These Scottish banks have been building up as fast as they can in order to establish Scotland as a financial centre rivalling London, a necessary step towards eventual independence. They've been taking huge gambles to do it by acquiring other banks and giving dodgy loans in order to build capital. With a capitalisation of £5 billion, how on earth could the Bank of Scotland take over Halifax, which was a larger bank? They did it in confidence that their fellow Scotsmen in Westminster would give them support that could never be available to them in their own country. Once again, England the loser, with the Scots being bailed out by the Scottish control government at Westminster. Had Scotland been independent, England would have been at least £23 billion better off, and Scotland would have been close to losing its banking industry. You may get a feeling of déjà vu here. In 1707 it was Scottish aspirations of empire that led them into bankruptcy, and it was English money that bailed them out. Unfortunately for the English, the Union was the baggage that came with that deal. A union that has enriched Scotland far beyond its own capabilities, and in the last decade unimaginably impoverished England. It is quite obvious where the bulk of the current bailout money has gone and who put it there. It is quite obvious who's going to foot the bill: the English. We have a visible £50 billion of our cash so far committed by Braveheart Brown and his darling buds of pay. The bank that has received most government money is the Royal Bank of Scotland. The British government is now the major shareholder, and the British government also now owns 70% of the Bank of Scotland. Now I quote Simon Heffer in the Telegraph dated the 12th of October. He says, "Mr. Darling says he perhaps hopes that, as with the Swedish bank rescue in 1990, he will be able to sell the shares at a premium a couple of years later." Are you starting to smell the stitch-up? They ensure survival of the two Scottish banks, put them back on the feet with English cash, and then sell them back at a price yet to be determined, or perhaps even as part of some future deal. Remember also Darling and Brown's pledges to save banking jobs in Scotland at the expense of those in England, when Lloyds made a bid to save the Bank of Scotland. This is the result of handing your government to treacherous foreigners who are under oath to make the interests of their own country paramount and use our country to accomplish that aim. Scotland first, last and always, with the added pleasure of robbing the old enemy. We desperately need to get the burden of Scottish greed off English backs. We simply can no longer afford to accept them as partners. They are not so much ruining the firm by incompetence as siphoning off the cash into their own accounts. The Scots are never going to go voluntarily. They cannot afford to lose access to the English purse. This puts England's right to self-determination back for possibly decades. The problem is that we can no longer be expected to keep the peripheral countries in a state of luxury that we can't afford for our own people. The Tartan Mafia will bankrupt England in the manner that they and generations of incompetent Scots have wrecked their own country to a point where it cannot survive outside a parasitic relationship. We need our own Parliament as never before, and the only hope of such a desirable solution lie with the campaign for an English Parliament and the English Democrats Party. They need your help and support, and in giving that help or support you're helping yourselves and helping to save your country. Stop thinking about it and start doing.